Hi, everyone. On behalf of the newly formalized Center on Race, Immigration, and Social Justice, I welcome you to the forum, The World on Fire, Environmental Justice Now. My name is Manuel Barajas, Professor of Sociology and Chair of CRISHE at Sacramento State. I would like to recognize those who helped organize and sponsor this event: Germán Barahona, Heidi Sarabia, Michelle Stevens, Luis Chavez, Latinos Unidos, Sacramento Services Not Sweeps, the Poor People's Campaign, Sacramento Regional Coalition to End Homelessness, Sacramento Area Black Caucus, and Sacramento State's Creative Media Center. Before we begin, we acknowledge this indigenous land where we stand as the home of the Miwok, Maidu, Naisanan, Mokelumne, Pakwin, and Winto people, among others. We honor their struggle for a better future in a world that has been impacted by colonialism that has stolen, exploited, and destroyed human lives and environments. Through this forum, we embrace cultures that support a healthier and more just world aligned with the values and practices that allowed indigenous people to thrive for thousands of years. In solidarity with indigenous people across the Americas, we hope this forum provides you the knowledge and motivation to collaboratively work for social and environmental justice. To this end, Germán Barahona with Latinos Unidos will introduce the keynote speaker, Katie Valenzuela, Director of the California Environmental Justice Alliance and newly elected City Council member of Sacramento. Congrats. After the talk, there will be a 15-minute intercession with music and art. Then Michelle Stevens, Professor of Environmental Studies, will introduce and moderate a panel discussion. A few house rules. This session is being recorded, as you know. All microphones are muted. Please also mute your cameras. Ask questions via chat after the keynote talk and after the panel discussion. And you're encouraged to rename yourself and include pronouns, he, him, his, what you feel, what reflects you. And we encourage respectful, equitable, inclusive, diversity, honesty, and healthy relations. And with that, I thank you greatly for joining us for this very special event. Germán.
Thank you, Dr. Barajas. Hello, everybody. My name is Germán Barahona. I'm the lead community organizer for United Latinos here in Sacramento, in the Sacramento Valley. We are a community organizing group focused on health and environmental justice issues, as well as other civic engagement concerns that the Latino community has here in the greater Sacramento Valley area. I think this person really doesn't need an introduction. She's taken Sacramento by storm, and it is my pleasure to introduce her because when I moved to Sacramento 5 years ago, my concerns around this town was, hey, I need to meet the movers and shakers, the opinion makers, the people that are really setting people on fire, right? And that was the kind of stuff that I was looking for. And everybody kept telling me, you have to meet Katie Valenzuela. So this is how we met. And just about 3 years ago, I got to say that when I walked away from that first one-to-one I had with her, there are two kinds of community organizers out there. There's the agitators that really get you angry and get you to act on a specific injustice. Katie, for me, is the agitator of the inspirational kind. She leads by example, and the words that come across a conversation with you do not enter one ear or out the other. She's the kind of person that inspires, and we need that so badly these days. And of course, to learn from that she's also a steward, a guardian for Mother Earth and climate change and for the injustice the poor people face, especially because of climate change issues at the local level, where we highlight as environmental justice. I think that for me, it's been a transformational experience, and I look forward to learning more from our keynote speaker, Katie Valenzuela, City Council-elect, but also a 20-year community organizer, which is the best credential you can have if you're going to run for office. So Katie, I'm going to hand it over to you and inspire the rest of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Herman. Thank you so much for that introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here with the new center with all of you. When I logged on and they said over 200 people had registered for this, I went, oh my goodness. But it just shows how relevant this conversation is, how important these spaces are, even in the pandemic, to keep talking, to keep questioning, to keep learning, and also to keep moving forward on our advocacy now more than ever. So as Herman said, I am environmental justice advocate. I actually just left my full-time position at Say How, which was hard to do, but coming into city council, I had to scale back a little bit on my day job, but I am still consulting for many of those members and doing a lot of specifically oil and gas work, which I'm happy to talk more about in the question and answer, since that is the next big fight we really have in California, is to fight the fossil fuel industry and to finally, hopefully, make some progress in that space. But today I want to talk to you more broadly about the movement here in Sacramento, around the state, and what we can be doing to bring environmental justice to our city and our region. So I will start my screen share here. Give me a second to... Okay, so it was interesting. We were reflecting on email about how when the title of this forum was created, it was actually before the fires. It was before we saw really the climate crisis take on a new form in California, and we started to understand and really experience the world that could be our future without more direct action. So, but I kept this title because I do think it goes to more than just the fires that we see. And I want to start by just talking about sort of the perfect storm that we are in right now, and the lessons that we need to learn from this moment, and what we can do to try to address it. So many of you know, well, obviously you all know that we're in the middle of a pandemic, and many of you might know that the pandemic impacts have not been felt by every community equally. In fact, very early on, we started to see spikes in communities of color, and at first, folks had a lot of hypotheses about, oh, it's a social thing, they're not listening to social distancing. Just a lot of bias came into the equation really quickly about why this was happening. But as we continue to collect data, as we continue to actually do direct outreach and engagement with folks in communities to understand what was happening, a much more complex photo and picture of what was happening started to arise. And really what this is, and this is when I talk about the perfect storm, is that what we realize is this risk that always existed in communities of color was really driving the increased hospitalization and the increase, oh, somebody's got whiteboard on. So the increased risk of COVID contraction, of hospitalization, the increased seriousness of the disease in communities of color. And this was due to a range of factors. Folks who had underlying conditions, cardiovascular disease, respiratory disease, really were at higher risk. Folks who were obviously had increased exposure because they were working on the front lines or living in different situations, as well as folks who just had poor access to healthcare and didn't know much about how to prevent exposure and what to do when exposure happened. But when you dig a little deeper, I think, into these causes and what get more specific into what we're talking about people who are less likely to have access to public benefits, to unemployment, to Medicare, to services that are needed due to physical distance, as well as just like straight eligibility, particularly for our undocumented population. You had folks who had a lack of savings and lack of assets, who were really directly impacted both by the employment shortage and then driven to do more essential work, to be needed. We couldn't really stop working because you couldn't afford to stop working. And so you saw more folks out in the community doing gig work, doing other frontline essential work during this pandemic, being people of color, because they needed to. It was a requirement for survival during this time. You also saw a huge impact from crowded housing. I remember there was a study done recently in Los Angeles, specifically looking at the Pacific Islander community and how, because they were living in such overcrowded situations, the pandemic really spread quite quickly. They were unable to isolate and social distance effectively, and so they were catching the disease at a much, much higher rate, which was attributed to their poor housing access and poor conditions. And then quite possibly the most disturbing revelation came came in a Harvard study a few weeks ago that showed that pollution was actually carrying the virus, that particulate matter itself was becoming this vehicle for virus transfer. It's an airborne virus, and we were seeing these spikes in communities that have a lot of pollution and particulate matter exposure. And all of this directly really speaks to a system. It speaks to systemic issues that communities of color have experienced for far too long. And what I want to talk today a little bit about is some of the ways that arose and why we see these disparities in communities of color. But I also use COVID-19 as an example because in the environmental justice movement, we're really using this pandemic as a cautionary tale, as an example of why climate justice and environmental justice is so important. It's not that climate change is obviously a global phenomenon. It will affect all of us, but it will affect people of color more severely because of these factors, because of the risk and the vulnerabilities that communities of color are more likely to be experiencing. And so the crux of our justice movement isn't just about reducing emissions and trying to prevent more climate change. Obviously, that's very important, but it's also about how do we address these factors so that communities of color, low-income communities, aren't going to be disproportionately impacted and may in fact actually benefit from our work as we try to create a cleaner and healthier environment. So, gosh, I don't know how to get that whiteboard mark to go away. So you'll have a little red scribble for the rest of the presentation. So speaking of how did we get here? What is the cause? And I'm going to focus really specifically on Sacramento, but I want to preface my comments by saying that this is a trend we see in communities across the state, across the country. What we've seen here is not unique, but it is an important story to tell because I don't think folks always think about environmental justice in Sacramento. We think about West Oakland, we think about East LA, we think about these communities that have organized for a long time, but we do have the same issues here in Sacramento. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what has happened. So this map made by Dr. Jesus Hernandez, longtime colleague of mine, shows what we call racial covenants. And some of you may have heard of this, but racial covenants were a practice until a few decades ago where home buying and purchasing was limited based on your race. So literally in the deed of a home, you had language that said this home cannot be sold to someone who is not white. And sometimes it would get more specific on the other side and say this cannot be sold to someone who's Japanese, who's Latino, who's, name your racial ethnic group that they were prejudicing against. And so these communities that are shaded in dark on this map were communities essentially created to be white communities. These were segregated communities. And so what you saw were people of color moving to the areas where they could access housing, which were largely the non-shaded areas on your screen. But what this means is so much more than a racial justice issue, because what did this lead to? This is an important point and foundational to the movement, right? Is what it meant when you had a concentration of affluence, a concentration of power. These were the communities, the white communities were able to build equity. They were able to access community assets like parks and community centers. They had more investment because the power was largely concentrated in these communities. And so what you saw very quickly emerge were that white communities really had access to a lot of the amenities that led them to be able to be healthy, to get good jobs, to get good educations. And communities of color were largely more isolated and lacked access to good educational opportunities, grocery stores, banks, a whole host of factors that really lead to your ability not just to build wealth and stabilize your community, but also to live healthier lives, to deal with crises when they emerge, to adapt when an adaptation is needed because you have the resources to do so. So these segregated communities were so much more than just where white people could live versus non-white people. This really led to an unfortunate pattern in investment that we still see a legacy of to this day. And to help illustrate this, I do start by showing this map, which will obviously be updated. And quick plug, if you have not filled out your census, today is the last day. Do it now, double check, make sure, spread the word. This is very, very important. But this map shows data from 2010. It's a racial dot map, and if you haven't played with this map for your hometown, I recommend it. It's a fascinating map. But what it shows in Sacramento is that white communities, white people, the blue dots, are still largely concentrated in the same neighborhoods that were built exclusively to be white. And communities of color, while more integrated than in other places, in other maps, you'll see all the red dots in one part of town, all the yellow dots in another part of town, all the green dots in another part of town. So we are more integrated relatively, but communities of color are still largely segregated away from white communities. You still see us living in North Sacramento and Oak Park and South, although the Oak Park numbers will probably change with the census, and going down into South Sacramento. And so pay attention to this arrangement that you see here, because I'm going to show you a couple more maps to illustrate my point. This map comes from the Center for Regional Changes, Regional Opportunity Index, another great resource you should check out if you're interested. But what it's showing is poverty. What it's showing are families who are living under what we would consider an acceptable income level for people to afford. And so red areas are parts of town that have very few people who are living at 200% of the poverty level. And green areas are the areas that have less poverty, people who have more assets and wealth. And what you see here, obviously, is that in the communities of color, where communities of color are concentrated, there is more poverty versus in the white parts of town, there's less poverty. When you go to another map here, my Tree Foundation folks on the call will smile and recognize this map, which they have been working hard to correct. I give lots of props for that. But this map was an interesting snapshot in time, because you even saw tree canopy is more concentrated in white communities than it is in non-white communities. I always like to ask the question, are trees racist? Which, of course, a tree is not an object that can have bias, but it really starts to paint this picture. And I can show you dozens of maps. I've made maps of police shootings, of bank access, of grocery access, of school quality. When you look at maps of where people are transferring out of public schools, where they're transferring to, you see the same trend over and over and over again, which is that the white communities, the communities that historically and are still currently predominantly white, have more positive assets, more amenities, more investment than communities who have historically and are currently still people of color. And this matters in a lot of ways. And it's not just a principle or a value judgment on this is wrong. This is literally leading to people living shorter lives. And I know this map is hard to read, but if you look at these gray areas on the map in the south area and in the north area, those are folks that are living on average 72 to 77 years. When you get into the blue areas, those are folks that are living into their 80s, mid to late 80s. So you're seeing a decade life expectancy difference in communities that are sometimes right next to each other. And it's a matter of, when you have to walk farther for healthy food, when you don't have educational opportunity, when you're cut off from access to finance. I remember when the Bank of America closed in Oak Park, it was great that there was a bank in Oak Park, but when they closed, we realized that they had only initiated one loan in that zip code the entire time that bank branch had been open. So this is about access to opportunity and about disinvestment. And that has led to life expectancy challenges, because obviously when you have less income, you have less access to the parks and the green spaces that enable you to live healthy lives. It will literally impact your health. But the unfortunate side effect then is what we try to do in a lot of cases, and what Sacramento has tried to do is then to say, okay, well then let's invest in these communities that have been left behind and really bring about the better outcomes and opportunities that we want to see. But unfortunately, without policy intervention, without protections in place, what this leads to are very predictable unintended consequences. Not only when you start to criminalize activities that had been normalized, folks who had gotten by dumping stuff on their street because they, had to get rid of trash that they picked up in their jobs, or people who were used to doing different activities who were now suddenly having police called on them for those activities. People who are now seeing rent increases or increased interest in code violation in auctioned houses. My neighbor Lucky here, his home had been on tax auction for years, but suddenly when things started picking up in Oak Park, suddenly there was interest and his house sold and he lost his home. You see real estate speculation. This house pictured here, I lived next door to this house. It was a vacant house. was a host of a lot of activity when I moved in. And when it sold at auction on probate, it sold for, I think it was $30,000. The owners at the time were this big real estate company in Oak Park, Grounded Real Estate. They invested about $100,000 into the house, slapped on some new paint, put in some new windows and floors, and sold the home for over $350,000. And they owned lots of properties around Oak Park. So suddenly they're able to build properties and bank, oh, this one sold for $350, now the next one can sell for $360. And you saw prices go up so quickly, it was hard for anybody to keep up. And that leads to displacement. It leads to gentrification. It leads to the things where now we've invested in this community. We wanted to help people who lived there. And oops, now all the people that lived there that we hoped would benefit are now gone. And so this really speaks to, it feels like we're a little trapped in a way. It's like, kind of like wrong if you do, wrong if you don't situation. That really is one of the crux of our environmental justice movement right now, and why a lot of environmental justice advocates across the state also consider themselves housing advocates, also consider themselves economic justice advocates, because this happens over and over and over again. We bring in the farmers market, we improve the park, we build the bike lanes, and suddenly the folks we hope to help are no longer there. So I'm going to loop this back to state climate policy, because it is, it seems like I'm going down this like weird path of like racial injustice and social injustice, but it is all connected, and it's connected actually in California's landmark law for climate policy, AB 32 by Fabian Núñez. This did more than establish our greenhouse gas reductions target. I think most of you have thought about this in context of the target, but what it did is actually a very robust bill. And what this bill recognized, and what advocates at the time fought for, was to recognize that environmental justice communities of color, and low-income communities were at additional risk, and that we deserved not only to benefit from those processes, we deserved to participate in those processes, we deserved to have a voice, and we wanted the progress to reducing emissions and making a more sustainable economy, because reducing emissions is overwhelmingly an economic shift, not just an environmental one, right? We wanted environmental justice communities to benefit from that. We wanted to be very intentional that we were going to try to correct these inequities by pursuing our climate target. It's a great bill if you have not read the whole text. But unfortunately, despite the fact that there's this really long bill, as you can see, that had all of this great detail, all of this great vision, they talked about housing and jobs and consultation and justice and investment. Really, all people talk about is the GHG target. All they talk about is we got to reduce emissions. And that's been really harmful for that vision. It's really delayed the justice that we hoped we would see. And to give you some charts to illustrate what we're seeing in California here, this is an emissions trend. It's a little out of date, but it shows you sort of the trends of emissions that we've seen in California since the law was passed, since AB 32 was passed. And what you'll see when you look closely at this chart is we've made a lot of progress on the electrical sector. Renewable energy is very popular. People love solar power. They love wind power. So that has gone really, really well. But a lot of these other lines really haven't changed that much. In some cases, they may be even on an upward trend. And so it really starts to make you wonder if maybe we're missing some of the transition we had hoped we would see when we wrote something like AB 32. And when you dig it even further, specifically looking at this industrial line, which covers a lot of sectors, when you break that out and look at what these sectors are doing, it gets even more troubling, right? You're starting to really realize that for the most part, we really haven't tackled those tough challenges yet. We haven't really got to the root of what AB 32 wanted. We may be meeting that emissions target, but we lost sight of that justice target. We lost sight of the transformation in our economy and our communities that we had hoped we wanted to see. And why does this matter? More than the fact that, we could pursue better justice through this, it also matters because communities of color are more likely to be living near these industrial sites. This is something that is over-concentrated overwhelmingly in communities of color. And this chart shows you, it's from a report by several academics that came out in 2018, where these facilities are located. And as you see, when you increase the number of facilities, you get 1 facility, 2 facilities, 3 facilities within 2.5 miles, which is largely, we measure pollution in a lot of ways, but I think a lot of folks folks recognize that it can travel quite far. So within 2.5 miles, you get to 5 or more facilities. That's overwhelmingly in communities of color. This is also a matter of perpetuating harm. This isn't just a matter of missing the opportunity of justice. While we have missed that opportunity, communities of color have been continuing to bear the burden, the health impacts, the environmental impacts, the impacts on their children, the impacts on their lives. Every day that we don't take real action, they are paying the price for that. And that is the call to action that we have now in this year, as we're looking at the next 10 years of climate policy. How do we really start to get serious about this? And this is a problem in Sacramento as well. I don't want you all to think that, oh, this is an issue in the Valley where they have lots of food processing and big facilities. We have this issue right here in Sacramento as well. And so what are we going to do to make sure that this isn't the legacy of the next 10 years of climate policy? How do we get serious, not just about reducing emissions, but about ensuring that the promises that we made to communities of color 14 years ago are finally realized? So this is where I start talking a little bit more about what we can do, because I don't want to just suppress. There are real strategies and real ideas that we could bring to Sacramento. And I always say, because I genuinely believe that Sacramento has the right people. We're the right city, the right region to really tackle this. We're the capital city. We've got great, brilliant minds here. We've got great diversity and resiliency in our communities of color. We could really figure this out in Sacramento. But what does it look like to really figure it out? So it starts with focus. It starts by recognizing that this isn't a region-wide thing. We can't focus regionally and expect to really get to the heart of justice. And I also like to talk about the curb cut effect. If you haven't read, Angela Glover Blackwell wrote a piece. She's the founding CEO of PolicyLink about the curb cuts. And you've all seen curb cuts on sidewalks. Curb cuts on sidewalks are made for folks with wheelchairs who have disabilities, who need greater access. But because we made that, it also benefits the parents with the stroller, the delivery truck folks with the carts. It benefits everybody because we targeted the intervention at the folks with the highest level of need. We really honed in on who has the highest barrier. And by doing that, not only did we help them, we helped everybody because we targeted towards the folks who needed it the most. So that's when we think about equity. This is about focus on communities who need it the most. And I like this visual because it gets away from that very problematic shorter person, taller person, inherent issues narrative. But I also love the justice variation. I found this online on an equity website last night of really the issue is we need to demolish the fence. But in the meantime, we can focus on how do we make things more equitable for folks who are living in these communities. And in Sacramento, these are where our communities are. They are the communities, and this is a state map from the Air Resources Board. It's showing low income and disadvantaged. Disadvantaged is our slightly problematic term for communities overburdened by pollution and environmental exposures. And this is where we need to focus. We must focus on the people who live in these areas that are highlighted. And I know it's hard to see, it's with the light pinks and the blues and oranges, but we have to focus on these communities because these communities are not only being burdened the most, but they have the most barriers to adoption. And so take something like decarbonizing buildings. For those of you who don't know, the big push right now is to get natural gas out of your homes because it's a very harmful appliance, not just for the environment as a whole, but for you in your homes as you are exposed to those fumes. So we say we want to get rid of electric appliances. Okay. Or we want to get rid of gas appliances and replace them with electric, excuse me. So let's look in South Sacramento. It's just saying we're going to give you a rebate for electric appliances. We're going to give you the phone numbers so you can call and get disconnected. Isn't it great? And we say, cool. Job done. We did our thing. Now everybody can replace their gas stoves. Well, unfortunately, in South and North Sacramento, we still have a lot of homes that have knob and tube wiring in them. We still have a lot of homes that can't handle the additional electrical load because their electrical systems are way out of date. They need massive improvement. So if we don't talk to people in those neighborhoods to understand that barrier, then we are going to they're not going to be able to take advantage of those rebates. They're not going to be able to transition their equipment again, and they will miss out yet again. So by consulting them early, you're making a policy that's going to help them. And by ensuring it helps them, you can help everybody. You ensure everybody can access it because you targeted it at the folks with the most need. The other example I like to use of this is solar panels. So when Grid Alternatives first came into Sacramento, they had all this money for solar panels, free solar panels, subsidized by the state. Isn't this wonderful? And they came to me when I was organizing in Oak Park because they were having a really hard time finding participants. And the reason they were having a hard time finding participants was not because there was not interest. There were lots of interests. You had no problem finding folks in these neighborhoods who said, yeah, I will totally take solar panel. The problem was that a lot of these lower income homeowners didn't have good roofs. Their roofs had not been fixed or maintained in a really long time. It's expensive to fix and maintain a roof. And if your roof is not up to par to hold the panels, you can't install the panels. But Grid Alternatives had not gotten funding for roof improvements because they didn't know, they didn't recognize that that would be a barrier. So by default, then the solar panels were only able to go to homeowners who already had a little bit of a leg up because they had the money to afford roof maintenance. And it didn't go to those homeowners who wanted them because they did not have those assets. And again, talking to homeowners in Oak Park, in South Sacramento, in Del Paso Heights could have avoided that because they could have built that in from the beginning to ensure that those communities could benefit, and by nature, everybody would be able to benefit. So this is what I mean when I talk about focus, not just ensuring that actual investments are moving into these neighborhoods, but that you're actually talking to people in those neighborhoods so that they can tell you what they need. They can tell you what they're worried about. When I first moved into Oak Park, they were building great like tree-lined bicycle lanes on Broadway, on MLK. And I told Lucky, gosh, isn't this cool? We're going to have all these great bike lanes. You know what he told me? He said, honey, those aren't for us. And I remember pushing back and saying, what do you mean they're not for us? And he's like, no, those are for the folks that are going to live here. You wait and see. And this was a 70-year-old man who had no computer, wasn't on Facebook, wasn't a part of the online conversations on gentrification, but he knew because he saw these improvements coming and he knew his own situation of housing vulnerability that we were all going to leave. And sure enough, a couple years later, both of us were gone from Oak Park because of those forces. So this is what it comes to with focus. How do we ensure that we're letting those communities lead so the solutions make sense for them and they're able to actually benefit? Process is so important. I always say in environmental justice, it's just as much about the outcomes and the focus as it is about the process. We don't want you to do this for us. We want to do it with you. And that means being proactive, not coming to communities after you already have your draft plan, your draft grant, your draft strategy, but really reaching out early so that we can be a part of that and give you input early. We feel like we're doing it together. And it's also about correcting this power imbalance. There's a very palpable power imbalance in these communities that they've been left behind, they've not been listened to. And really to confront that requires them to be engaged. It requires you to build that capacity to engage in the process with you, not just doing it for them. So being proactive, educating folks on the issues, I cannot emphasize this enough. If you say my options are A or B, I'm going to pick between A or B. And I might not know that options C, D, E, or onwards are even an option to me, but you can't say that I really picked for myself if you didn't tell me all the options that were available. And I use an example of Delta Shores and Meadowview, one of the last big projects we had in Sacramento. And that was what the developer did. He did early outreach, but he's just like, oh, do you want this configuration or that configuration? Big mega shopping center, never once told the residents that mixed use was an option, never once talked about what it would look like to make it more walkable, to make it more conducive to housing, living near the businesses. And everybody in Meadowview just wants a neighborhood. They say that they want a neighborhood. They want to be like Midtown. You know, they want to be able to walk to the coffee shop, to be able to get the food, to have the local businesses, to have the opportunity that we have in the central city. But they didn't know. And after that project was approved and they thought it was this great victory, there were a series of conversations when they realized that they had been tokenized, that they really hadn't been as empowered as they thought they were. And that was a really upsetting conversation to have with them, to realize that they could have asked for something different and they didn't know that that was an option. So don't hide the options from folks. Let folks pick what's best for them, and that means making sure they know all of their options. a big thing, especially for agencies and universities and folks coming in from the outside. Having an independent facilitator can work wonders. It can really balance the power in the room and really ensure that someone's looking for who's speaking, who's not speaking, and ensuring that everybody's really doing it together. And it can really help with agenda planning and transparency as well. So I also like to show this chart because I once had a local elected person or someone who works for local electeds. They sent me this email once. And then when they were telling the legislature what they had done for outreach, they said, oh, we talked to Katie Valenzuela. She knows about this. She's okay with it. And he was basing that conclusion off of the fact that he had sent me an email that I had never responded to. I actually never saw the email. I think he didn't have the right address, but he said, great, we checked the box, we engaged you. But that's not what most folks are looking for. What they're really looking for is when you get up into the 6, 7, 8 category on here, we're looking for partnership. We're looking for some level of decision-making authority. And ideally, we're looking for projects to be based off of what we want as residents, not based off of what a government entity thinks is best for us or what some outside consultant or NGO thinks is going to be great because it fits with their mission and their strategic plan and their vision, but not necessarily ours. So you have to have trust a little bit in the process that what the residents want and what they think is best when they're given all the information is really what's best for them, that they know best in the end, and facilitate a process really with that in mind. And third, and finally, when it comes to how do we do this, I remember giving a very similar presentation to Smud. Gosh, it must be 5 years ago now, we gave this presentation to Smud. And for those of you who don't know, Smud, not too long ago, approved a permit for a natural gas storage plant underneath a neighborhood in Avondale-Glenelder in southeast Sacramento. Happens to be the first neighborhood where Black GIs were able to use their benefits to buy houses, and has this naturally occurring reservoir underneath it. And so a natural gas company saw an opportunity. They wanted to pump a bunch of natural gas underneath those homes and give everybody checks during Christmas time over the holidays to lease the land under their home. By the time neighborhood advocates heard what was going on, they had gotten lease agreements for almost half of the properties, and Smud had given them that permit. They had okayed this project. And thankfully, the neighborhoods were able to fight, and Naila Popardin will be on later. Definitely ask her about that fight to get it withdrawn at the Public Utilities Commission in San Francisco. They appealed it all the way to the state and won. It was one of our best David and Goliath stories in Sacramento. But we went to Smud because we wanted to talk about environmental justice, and they wanted to learn. But one thing I remember is one of the board members asked me at one point, you know, aren't we okay in Sacramento? Forget exactly how he phrased it, but he basically said, you know, I think we're doing pretty good. So when do we say that environmental justice has been achieved? When do we say that, you know, we've done pretty good in Sacramento, so like we don't need to really keep talking about this? And before anybody could really stop me, I jumped back up to the microphone and said, we will be done when these maps don't look like this anymore. We will be done when I can no longer predict how long you will live, what your water quality is, what your air quality is, what your job access is, what your educational outcomes are by where you live and the color of your skin. When we get to that point in Sacramento, we will be done. And unfortunately, we have a long way to go in Sacramento, and we still have a lot of work to do. But I am more convinced than ever in this moment of realizing how much risk is out there, this pandemic, really recognizing how much we have to do will hopefully ignite a fire from all of you in this room and on this Zoom to keep doing that work and to push further and faster than we ever have before, so that we can look back on this time as that moment when we changed the course for Sacramento's future. So with that, I know I did not take nearly the time. I always say, you guys give me so much time. I never talk that long, but I would love your questions in the chat, and I'll pitch it back to Herman to take us through a conversation.
Thank you, Katie. So everybody in the audience, you're welcome to submit your questions in the chat box. There are 134 of you here, so if it's okay with the group, we're going to go and pick some of the questions. So please feel free to start writing them, and then we'll just go through them as they start popping up in the chat box. Just to give you some context, in these environmental justice zones, you have close to 500,000 Sacramentans in the county that are low income, that earn less than $2,000 a month, and they're living in these EJ zones. And so when they're being asked to do all these transitions to new technologies and whatnot. Think about the average rent in this town. That's about $1,200 a month. And so this is really why environmental justice is such an important focus, because if we're really going to include people, we have to consider the realities uh, that they're facing in these neighborhoods. Let's see. Any questions from the peanut gallery? Okay, here we have one from Isabella. As students, how are ways that we can contribute to Sacramento?
That is a great question. A little more of my background is that I actually got involved in the work when I was 13 in Kern County. They had a problem where youth were really struggling in Kern County at the time, and they had all these meetings going on trying to figure out how to help. And my dad was in those meetings and finally said, like, wait a minute, you don't actually have any youth in this room, and maybe we should bring in some youth to help us figure this out. And so that's really how my activism began, was by someone telling me that my experience was important, and getting me involved in listening. So as students, and I'm not too far older than you all. I'm going to be the first millennial on the city council, and so we're going to live with this a lot longer than folks who are currently doing this work, and we really have an opportunity to step forward. What we've seen work with the Sunrise Movement, with other youth-led movements in Sacramento and across the country, has been incredibly powerful at pushing the conversation, pushing the race conversation, pushing meaningful change, and really just in general keeping the fire lit underneath our electeds and underneath folks in power to do what they can to do more than they're doing right now. So I'm a huge believer in students and youth getting engaged in the movement. I think you all have access to a creativity that even I don't totally understand, with digital media and with videos, with spreading the word, with educating folks. That is really valuable. And your own lived experiences as folks who are in the community right now, who are going to be living with the impacts, are really important. What is the world that you want in 20 or 30 years? Because that's what we should be aiming for, not what, folks who are at the end of their careers really think is right, but like what's going to make sense for you as you live your life in our region. So getting involved in Sunrise Movement is probably the best recommendation I can give you. The Sunrise Movement Sacramento Hub is incredible, and is really building their capacity and moving really quickly, and I've been incredibly impressed by them. So that would be one recommendation I would give. But in general, however you plug in, whatever group you plug into, just plug in, because we need more students to get involved in the movement.
Okay, so the next question here is, and I think it's coming for a couple of folks, but this video is recorded and will be available after today's session. So make sure you connect with Chris J online, and they'll have it. They'll have the link there. So one question here from Steve Roberts is, how much help do you get from companies and contractors who understand things like this? What it takes to install solar panels on roofs, and the need to change out electrical panels to switch all of the electric homes to all electric homes. Where is Smud on this? What's your experience with that?
I've just started talking to Smud about this. I was actually on a call just yesterday with a couple of Smud board members where we started to talk about building decarbonization specifically, both in terms of energy generation, solar panels, storage, but also in terms of getting out natural gas from the homes, and really building those pilots. I think what we need to do is try it out with a few folks, find some people in South Sac and North Sac who are willing to help try it, so we can figure out what it takes, and we can really build the right incentives to really bring those contractors and folks on board. And I think what we'd all love is to see more of a pipeline between Sac State and other local colleges and universities, so that students who are interested in that can maybe have a pipeline into a career doing that work in communities. There are some nonprofits who are trying to train folks in this, but I think we still have a long way to go on figuring out the access for the electrical home stuff. And that's something that, we're so lucky to have a publicly owned utility in Sacramento. Just watching what's happening with PG&E around this region just every day makes you more grateful that we're Smud customers. But I think we still have a lot of work to do on this, and I think they seem really interested in helping figure it out.
I'm gonna blend two questions here, one from Ann Pratt and Ronald Jimenez. These Is there a way to have access to the resources you shared today? And the second part to this that Ronald is asking is it possible to have this kind of education in elementary schools to start developing young people awareness in EJ?
Absolutely. I will never not say no if I can to an opportunity to speak to a class, because this is missing. In fact, I mean, I grew up in Oildale in Kern County, and really, really bad asthma. Really suffered a lot as a child. I tell this story about how I decided to try out for soccer, and we would run laps around the campus because it was about 2 miles, and they sent me to an eye doctor because my vision got really weird when I was running, and they thought maybe my retina was detached or some issue was going on. And after months of tests and they didn't find anything wrong, one of my doctors finally asked me how my breathing was when I was running. And we figured out that it wasn't my eyes at all, that I was blacking out from running because I wasn't getting enough oxygen into my lungs. My asthma wasn't being well controlled. And this was after a whole youth of being hospitalized. I still have a nebulizer in my house. I still don't go outside when the air quality goes above because this is it's serious for me. And I did not know what environmental justice was. I grew up among the largest oil fields in the state of California, and I didn't realize till I got to college and did a seminar. There was a grad student presenting research that we got extra credit to go to, and she used the example of kids growing up with asthma in the valley as one of her examples of environmental injustice. And I remember sitting in the audience and thinking, like, wait a minute, she's talking about me. Like it was this moment, this light bulb moment for me to realize that what I had experienced was connected to deeper structural issues. And that's endemic across our curriculum when it comes to Native people in California, when it comes to race and really telling the story of what's been going on. How many of you went through school and never heard about redlining, never heard about racial covenants in any real deep way and what that meant for where you live, and how empowering in a way can that be to have that information, to realize that there's not some inherent reason why your community is doing poorly. It's also because it was designed that way. And how can we build more activism from students by helping them see themselves in history, in context, in a real way? So I would, I mean, curriculum is a whole thing that we can talk about, but by now the best thing I can think to do is to be coming in and to build alliances with these teachers, these amazing teachers we have, to come in and just teach students ad hoc. I've done a lot of high school presentations, a lot of junior high presentations, teaching kids about pollution burden, about what's going on in Sacramento, and it's always been amazing every time I've done it. So I think if folks are interested in doing more of that, I'm interested as much as I can, or maybe we can recruit Herman and get him engaged and others like him so that we can get our students engaged, help them understand.
So there's several questions again from the audience about how to get involved. I think you covered a lot of that. So just to repeat this, right, Katie, this is about getting your skin in the game. Join a group, join a nonprofit, join your local activist group that's focused on environmental justice, housing, jobs. There's a few questions about jobs. There is one, I think, that makes the point that from Rhonda Rios Kravitz, the struggles for immigration justice and climate justice are inextricably linked. Can you address that, that displacement of our immigrant communities in the area and impact of COVID-19?
Oh, absolutely. I could go, I almost did a whole divergence on my slide deck and I caught myself and I should have done it. Even today, so with the fires, right, wildfires, California has been really investing heavily in trying to address forest maintenance and backlog fire issues to try to prevent these big wildfires from happening. And what we found really quickly, because there's a lot of money, they were trying to spend it really quickly, what the state was doing was they were subcontracting out to folks to try to get the work done more quickly. And what those subcontractors were doing was they were going and getting the undocumented workers from the farm, from the fields, from the agricultural fields, and bringing them up to do the work. And what we had was repeated firsthand stories of folks meeting folks out there, didn't have gloves, didn't know the chemicals that they were using, weren't properly trained, weren't being paid living wages. And it just was another example of the just vulnerabilities. Like when you think about all these vulnerabilities and kind of keep layering on, if you don't speak English, if you're not documented, if you can't access resources or protections from the law because you're worried about reporting things because you don't want to be deported or raise a flag that could have a bad impact on you, it just makes it worse. It's like a magnifying impact. And we're seeing climate migration happening more and more frequently. It's going to continue to happen. And how do we be really thoughtful about addressing those systems too? It's actually, climate justice. I did this great presentation, this panel. It's your Health Foundation with criminal justice reform folks. And they were talking about how a lot of folks who end up in jails are from climate and environmental justice communities. A lot of these jails are in environmental justice communities. So addressing criminal justice reform was also an environmental justice issue. We were trying to reduce the frequency that folks were interacting with these systems that hurt them. And the same goes for ICE. The same goes for these systems that really don't that harm people and don't create systems that folks can work within so that they can get the protection of the law and be able to not experience those additional vulnerabilities. So I know I just went all over the place, but even when the fires happened in Sonoma 2 years ago, I think a lot of you will remember that the evacuation orders were only sent out in English, and there were a lot of folks who got harmed and who were in really dangerous situations simply because they didn't know that they were in an evacuation zone. So, so many things that we can layer on to what we need to be doing, what we can do in California right now in terms of access and protections and who can access the services and the resources of the law and of the public benefits when we roll them out, but also how do we keep fighting for a more just federal system that recognizes this global migration that's already underway.
So the other question here that I see is from Catherine Jameson. Given your effective work in community organizing, why move to city council work? What do you expect is the place of agitation would offer you or us? I appreciate your work, Catherine says. Will you be needing a senior faculty intern?
I have to say this was a real grapple, and why I've been asked to run for years. They always say that women need to be asked 7 times before they run. I think for me it was closer to 70 times that I was asked, and every time I was like, no, I don't want to run. I would rather be outside of the structure, pushing the structure. But you realize really quickly, and I've heard this from a lot of women who are elected around the country, that you're spending so much time and energy trying to get a decision maker to make the right decision that you realize maybe that time and energy would be better spent being one of those decision makers, and being that ally on the inside. And I believe that, working for members like Eduardo Garcia at the Assembly, he really understood and showed me how powerful it was to have inside-outside strategy and to be able to work. But really, it wasn't until the organizing got to this level in Sacramento, and you can feel it right now. I know you can all feel there's like a level of activism. It's always been there, but it's really reached a new level, and that's exciting to me. And that was a big part of why I decided to run, because in 2018 I suddenly started to see these coalitions and organizations and organizers starting to really grow in their confidence and their skills and start moving serious advocacy campaigns, that I realized that I didn't need to be outside, that there were people who could be outside and I could be inside and we could work together. And so that's what I'm looking forward to the most. And in terms of internships or working with, I saw a couple other questions in the chat. As a new council member, your budget's on the lower end until you can roll forward some money. But I would love to work with as many of you as I can, as I can, either as volunteers in the community work, through the people's budget, through other campaigns that I'm involved in, or through my more official roles. So we can stay in touch.
Thank you, Katie. There's another question here. Well, let's see. If this is a comment from Kimmy Parker. We need more people like you in our city councils. And then Catherine again said, right on. Gabriela del Cid Lopez. Katie, thank you for your words. They're very inspiring. I have taken it into an intro into community development in junior college. And all the themes I learned, I just saw it today with your presentation. Thank you for that. Let's see. Alex also mentioned the thing about internships. I gotta put a plug for United Latinos here because
Yes.
we're an EJ organization in Sacramento, and there's some agitational work. They're poorly funded, so interns are the best opportunities to learn how these operations make change with a shoestring budget. So definitely, is this something that you'd like to support, Katie?
Definitely. And I do want to
Yeah.
say, like, my election to the council was just like the sort of the indicator, the first, like the tip of the iceberg, I think, of the change happening in Sacramento. And you should know, in addition to another great woman running in District 8, Mai Vang, there could be 3 seats open in 2022. So I'm just going to plant the seed right now for some of you on this call. If you're interested in running, I mean, this is, I think, what the election of Donald Trump did, and what a lot of these this political experiences, I don't know how else to say it in a more to a large audience, has taught us, is that you have to be engaged. Not being engaged really isn't an option anymore. And whether it's as an organizer, as a volunteer, as an intern with United Latinos, as someone who starts interning in politics or trying to get involved and maybe run yourself someday, there is a whole network of folks now in our region and around the state who are looking to support folks like you. I've seen it now firsthand, and it's exciting to think about what we can accomplish coming out of this really bad crisis to make things better. But I am just one person. I need more of you to run in the future. So planting that seed now. Let me be one of those 7 for some of you women on the call that is asking you to run.
Yeah. A question from Caroline Batch. How are these conflicting age groups and ideas expressed in the midst of your work, especially handling with policy and environmental issues? What improvements and difficulties are there specifically?
I mean, we're still, you'll notice I spent a lot of time in my presentation talking about listening to communities and letting communities lead. I wish I could say that was just because it was super important and I wanted to reemphasize it, but I also say it a lot because it's the biggest struggle we have still, is really being intentional about reaching out and listening to folks who are impacted by these issues, and giving them the opportunity to have a leadership role in the changes that we try to create. Another great example is with folks who don't speak English. I mean, how many of you have been to a public meeting in Sacramento, or anywhere for that matter, that has had somebody who's needed interpretation because they don't speak English? And yet 1/3 of Sacramento doesn't speak English as their first language. So that's 1/3 of our city that is not being included off the bat. And so I think that is still the biggest challenge, is we still like to design systems for people. We think that we can save people, and we come at it usually with really good intentions, with really good research, with really good modeling. This is what we need to do. But by not asking them, by not letting them be a part of it, we're not only furthering this disempowerment that's happened to communities, but we're missing sometimes really great insight and important work that could be done. So that's by far the biggest challenge we've had, and something that I will note is pretty evenly spread, unfortunately, across the age groups. I do feel that, like, when I work with Sunrise Youth and others, that they're a lot more open to doing that outreach and engagement. So maybe that's something. I spent a lot of my career being that person who was speaking and never really heard in the room. It's kind of weird for me to be in a different position now for that reason. I used to have to make my case. Sometimes I'd have to have other people say my case for me so that it would be heard. And so I think we can all do a better job of making sure we're listening really to the folks in the room and being thoughtful about doing that outreach.
And this is a question. I just lost it. Let me see. Here it is. From Martha Nungesser. How can this area keep housing costs and rent low enough to not allow gentrification to drive out long-term residents? Areas closer to downtown will continue to be desirable to live in, and that means the prices will rise. And second, do you have any insight into work focusing on these issues?
Yes, I love this question. I spent a lot of time thinking about gentrification because it felt like this inevitable outcome of neighborhoods improving was that people wanted to live there and housing prices would go up. And there are a lot of solutions actually that exist, some of which exist, some of which are more theoretical. But I think in practice, how do you protect renters that are there now from having spikes in their rent, which is a very hotly debated topic at this moment, in case you're living under a rock and haven't seen the hundreds of campaign ads out right now. How do we protect renters so that it doesn't go up too high and they can continue to stay where they've been? How do we protect homeowners like Lucky, my neighbor, like other neighbors who lost their homes for a variety of issues that they couldn't keep up with, on limited income? If your roof is damaged, you get a code violation issue. That code violation is really in the interest of keeping you healthy and safe, but if you can't afford to repair that code issue, you're out of luck right now. There's not a lot of programs out there who can help you with that. And so how do we build those supports, financial supports for homeowners, so that they don't have to leave their home unless they want to? But then the third and probably most revolutionary practice that we have just starting here in Sacramento with community land trusts. And the way land trusts work is they pull parcels out of the market. And so you don't have to worry about market prices anymore. It's controlled by the community. So it's okay that maybe housing prices are going up around you, but there's parcels scattered in the neighborhood, apartment buildings, open spaces, business buildings, homes that are not subject to market fluctuation. And the way it works is like essentially the community owns the land, you're leasing that land. You can still build equity, but you're not going to build market equity, because what you're doing when you sell that home or you decide to leave is it's going to the next person, it's coming back to the trust and going back out to folks who are eligible. So maybe we say you're going to build X% of equity each year. You can still build equity, but you're not going to sell it to the highest bidder. You're going to sell it back to the land trust, because that's the agreement we made. So you get predictable wealth building, predictable asset development, and the community gets continued access to housing and space in communities. You can't build more land, but you can protect the land so that people can still remain there for the long term. So those are sort of the three prongs of what it's looking like, and each of them in some form is in motion in Sacramento right now through the Sacramento Community Land Trust, of which I helped start in Sacramento, through like renter protection movements and even homeowner assistance like through NeighborWorks and others like that. So we could do more always, but those are three strategies that we need to really seriously invest in.
Yeah, so I think you answered a lot of these questions that are still floating here about how do people get involved, engaged, how to integrate it into their personal careers, whether they're civil engineers, teachers, etc. Let's see, maybe we have about 5 more minutes left. So if you have more questions, feel free to send them through the chat box. But what's one thing you would say, Katie, about say you're a civil engineer or a teacher, and you come into a career track that's really excluded from environmental justice or from these real social justice issues? What can they do if they're not finding that in their career? What is your suggestion?
I am a huge champion, in case you can't tell, of volunteering in the community and getting involved on your own time. I mean, it's the dream that you have a day job that aligns with all of your values and you get to do that work. And some of us get to live that dream and are really lucky for that. But it's not always been the case. It's not always been the case for me. You know, I've been the barista working my way through school. I've been the bus driver working my way through school. You know, that wasn't a values alignment job. That was a job I needed because I needed to pay my bills. So I got involved in my own time. And what I've appreciated about that is you can get involved in things you're passionate about, and you can really just do it the way you want to do it. You can contribute in the way you want to contribute, and without the pressure of, you know, gosh, if I don't do this, or I got to do all these other things, so I got to keep this gig. It's a way to really build structures that make sense for you. And sometimes you can start those groups. You know, for a long time we had a group locally called the Sacramento Young Professionals of Color, and we would just meet for happy hours. It just started as like a networking thing, and then we started bringing in older professionals of color just to chat about their lessons and what they did, and it ended up growing into this really cool network that just a year or two ago stopped meeting. But you know, we created that because we saw a gap, and that was something we were passionate about at that point in our careers. So I think the movement requires all skill sets. the people who are going out and helping fix those homes, who are volunteers with Neighbor Works on their big volunteer weekends, the folks who are going out to help Habitat, the folks who are going out to do all sorts of work in the community, either paid or unpaid. It's a variety way. We need all skills, from engineers to, tradespeople to, more organizers, social justice folks. If you do math, accounting, oh my gosh, if you volunteer right now, if you call the land trust people and say, I'm really good at math, they're going to immediately grab you and come in and do our work because we need your help. It's just, we need all of the skill sets. It's really about finding what's passionate for you. And if you're lucky, you can eventually align your career there. You're going to build networks, you're going to build connections. And I got really lucky in the fact that every time I moved around different jobs, I kept those networks and those contacts. And eventually they created jobs for me and created opportunities for me that I had because they knew me and we had a relationship. So I would just say, if you can't be your day job, if you've got to do other things, try to find a way to plug in however you can, because there's a lot of groups. There's student groups, there's neighborhood groups, there's organizations like United Latinos that are doing the work in different levels, and it'll really just be good for your soul too to just be plugged in that way on your own.
Thank you, Katie. And I think that this is, we're going to take one more question to complete this section of the presentations today. This one comes from Isabella Visuet. Are there any protections for farm workers and migrant workers during the pandemic? Is Sacramento doing anything to protect those communities who are unable to shelter from air quality issues and the pandemic?
Gosh, I wish I had a better answer for you on this. Sacramento really messed up on our COVID response, particularly for immigrants. We got $181 million at the county level. That money could have gone to temporary housing. If you needed to isolate, it could have gone to contact tracing and personal protective equipment for folks who couldn't afford it. And we sent most of it to the sheriff. I wish I could tell you why. I don't really understand, other than the fact that the city executive decided to give the money to Sheriff Scott Jones instead of giving it to public health, even though they asked for it. But thankfully, there's been really good community level response with NorCal Resist and others who fundraise for assistance checks and to help people pay for groceries, pay for rent, pay for utility bills. But we really missed an opportunity, I think, in Sacramento to be more diligent about we did a survey. I did this survey. A few of us modeled it off of each other after that initial survey. 300 people filled it out in a day. And overwhelmingly, the need they cited was food assistance and rent and mortgage assistance, overwhelmingly. But our city took 6 months to do that, and when they did it, it was with only a few million of the 89 million that we got. So I wish I could say better what was out there. Unfortunately, it's not much. So I think other groups, there's been a lot of UndocuFund and other funds that are both for undocumented, but just in general for folks who can't access the other supports. If they need to take time off work, maybe they've got pre-existing conditions and they're worried about getting COVID and it having a bad impact, where they could try to find support to stay home and stay safe, or to isolate if they need to. So it's a foreboding tale. So I say, this is the perfect storm for us to learn from in Sacramento and beyond about how to be better when the next crisis comes, because unfortunately it will, and how to maybe be a little bit more intentional about how we build for the future so that this is less likely to happen again.
Well, thank you, everybody. This concludes our question and answer series with our famous and brave leader, Katie Valenzuela. She's an incredible example, and she really teaches us all that we have to become active beyond just putting our likes on Facebook, being a social media activist. This is about putting your skin in the game, and Katie models that from the time that she arrived to this county 10 years ago. So thank you very much. It's been an honor being part of this today. I'll hand it over to Manuel and Heidi to transition to the next phase of this day today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Katie. We are just going to have a break from now until to 1:30. In the meantime, we have some music and some art that we are going to showcase, but you can take a break. We will come back at 1:30 for the next panel. Thank you very much.